expenditures that have taken place. And we also have, we're working on finalizing, or working towards finalizing our FY23 local allocation plans, which is basically the predictions of what the projects and the spending might be for our year coming up starting July 1. We do have most of those local allocation plans back from our member jurisdictions, and again, that will be on the TAC agenda next week to look in detail at the projects and receive any additional updates that might be forthcoming. Making progress.
Making progress. Any questions for Mr. Parsons? Mr. Parsons, you got item 7 as well?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I wanted to provide a brief update this morning on the regional project prioritization process. This is mainly focusing on the 35% regional funds, and as you know, the framework has been adopted by the authority in terms of how projects can be considered, what makes them eligible, how the scoring will take place, and eventually moving towards the establishment of a project list for dedication of those regional funds. At this point, we are, I will say, 80% of the way through that entire process. We are considering right now FY23 to 26. The authority has already made commitments for FY21 and 22 to the fall line and the additional regional projects that were voted on in December. For FY23 to 26, we have a project list that meets the criteria of the framework, the scoring framework. It is divided into 4 categories: bicycle, pedestrian, bridges, highway, and PE only. And we have our draft scores and cost benefit analysis completed. The remaining steps that need to take place is, as Mr. Ear mentioned, we are currently under contract with a third-party firm to provide validation of the cost estimates that were provided as part of these regional project allocations. We expect for that process to be wrapped up by the 17th. Right now, I think the estimates are complete, but we're allowing a week or so time for the firm to have direct meetings with member localities to make sure that the estimates reflect the intent of the application and make sure that everything checks off, so that everyone has a chance to weigh in. And we expect to have an update for next week's TAC meeting, but again, the finalized estimates won't be finished until the 17th. But we are still moving forward with the planned and the approved public hearing that is now set for our April authority meeting, the 29th, I believe. And that will be to consider this FY23 to 26 project list, as well as the phasing, the timing, basically everything that all the plans that are set forth for moving these projects forward into the construction and approval process.
Sure. Mr. Brown.
So the list that the TAC is pulled together is not resource constrained. Is that the understanding? Is that my understanding? Is that correct?
That is correct.
So it's just going to be, here are the projects enumerated based upon the cost benefit score. And essentially, once we determine the resourcing, we'll just, in theory, go down the list, or this body, the entirety of the body can decide which projects off the list to fund. But it's not a resource. I think what was the gross number of all the projects in aggregate that were submitted? It's like $2 billion.
Cost estimate, it was about 800 million.
800 million total.
Yes, Mr. Brown, you're exactly correct. We had I think the final eligible project list was about 32 or 33 projects. And our expectation is that by the time we get to the April finance meeting and TAC, we will have a suggested phasing plan. Staff is going to take the first stab at that to make those selections in terms of what fits into the schedule and where things are. I mean, some of the projects have already had their PE finished. Some are ready to go to construction now. This is where the art comes into play. And we'll have a draft recommended phasing plan and priority list for review by the finance committee and the TAC. And we can adjust as needed based on feedback from the members and what should actually be on the public hearing.
I guess the one point, if we dealt with this last couple meetings, this is the debt policy, and I guess, one of the questions ultimately would be, depending on how we ultimately decide to execute that, the pay-go versus the debt model, that then determines the resourcing that would be available to fund. So it may be that but in no event, right, we'd be able to address all of the projects that have been submitted in the 23-26 plan, because we wouldn't have resources to do that, right? We're only pulling in about 60 million a year in the regional pot, so 60 million times, let's say, for 3 years. So you're only talking about roughly 4 years of 240 million to fund 800 million projects. So again, that's something I think that we still have to revisit. I know that we did a preliminary adoption of the debt policy, but I think that until we really understand the projects and have a discussion about our substantive and qualitative desire, I think we need to recognize we need to be flexible on that, and we now have a financial advisor that can help us think through all that. So.
Mr. Peters. Agree completely with Mr. Brown on this. I think that we did set a starting position, but that's subject to change now that we have financial advice coming in to work with us. I do have a question though on, this is obviously a 3-year plan that we're talking about here, through 26 rather than a 5 or 6 year plan. But we've got this list of projects, and I guess this is procedural. I can foresee a situation where we've got some projects that were never submitted that might come up within the next year or two that might actually rank better than the ones we've already ranked. Will we be re-ranking everything each year as we go forward and reviewing additional projects that may come forward? Or are we trying to make all these commitments at one time at this point?
I'll look to the TAC chair as well, but I think that the process is established so that every time we have an application window that's on an annual basis or a biannual basis, we re-rank based on what we know at the time. So if there are commitments made for this 4-year window, we can scale back and say, we're committed through right away. We still need construction money, so those asks might be changed. But yes, I think that's correct.
Is this going to be done annually or biannually? Well, you just said annually or biannually. Do we have a policy as to how often we're going to relook at this or not?
I think we're focused right now on the first round, and I think that's a consideration that needs to be fully taken into account. I think it could be at any.
If I could address that to Mr. Ewing.
Mr. Ewing.
Yes.
They're the ones that really handle most of that issue.
So the question was annual versus biannual?
Or, how often do we revisit this range?
Yeah, I think our guidelines say annually we'll revisit. So as Mr. Parsons was saying, for example, a number of the applications are proposing to leverage against smart scale. So as we go through the smart scale process, we'll see how those projects rank out, and if they're recommended for funding, then we develop a spending plan and schedules based on the smart scale program. If projects are submitted for smart scale using to leverage CVTA regional funds, if they're not selected, then this group and as well as TAC will need to consider whether we keep the funding on that project for another round of smart scale and basically divide that money for those years, versus pivoting and taking that money to apply towards other projects. So that's something that will need to be done on an annual basis.
Okay, so if new projects did come along that actually rank better than the ones we've already commenced, and they're not just put out in the dark and wait for 5 years from now.
Correct, and also as we move through each year, you add another year of regional funding, coming in on the out years, as well as any money that's freed up on the front end years, and that's where we'll also rely on our financial advisor to basically look at, how we can maximize and leverage that funding for maximum number of projects that are priorities for the region.
Mr. Yu, I would hope also that as we look at the flexibility of doing this, you may have a plan that may be in second tier, and then you learn the process even better, so that plan may be modifications the second time like that. So I think that just is what's hard for the system to work itself in. I call it flexibility part of the system.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I mean, the goal is to move the best projects along, and as those project specifics change and priorities change, then the goal is to have flexibility to make those adjustments.
Mr. Carroll.
It's also possible that a project could get funded in a different way and actually be taken off the list.
Absolutely.
So that would have an opening, which would require us to take a look at the project as well.
That's a very good point, yes, Mr. Carroll. So with the federal funding still sort of looming out there that will be coming, for example, I can speak to some of the Henrico projects. We're submitting applications for federal funding as well as for regional funding. So obviously, if we're able to get federal grants to do all or portion of these projects, then at that point that would release the funding that would potentially be tied up on the regional level.
Mr. Burke, you want to add anything?
No, sir. I think you all have addressed it properly and reasonably. I think you might want to consider whether you want an annual vetting process or a biannual vetting process, as Mr. Parsons suggested. The more often you do it, the more resources it takes, obviously. So you might want to just steady as she goes, maybe start off with a biannual.
Just always a reminder that we're still building this thing as we fly it.
Well, I think Mr. Stewart said.
Or tried it,
Said that annual is what they're better sure now, so sure.
And if I can add,
Yes, maybe walk.
if I could add, maybe it won't be a full
Use the bus.
application process every year. Maybe it's just a review of the status of all the projects and the adjustments that need to be made at that point.
All right. Any more questions for Mr. Ure? All right, we'll move on to new business. Item A is the Financial Advisory Services Update, PFM Introduction. I'll hand it over to Mr. Parsons.
Thank you very much. I wanted to introduce our PFM team here with us this morning to do a brief introduction. Kevin Roddy is leading the team, and Kevin, I don't know if you wanted to take a few minutes and introduce your folks with you, and you can, I'll get the slides on the screen.
Sure, sounds good. First of all, we're so excited to be here. We look forward to working with you on this, exciting engagement here. We were asked to do a couple things, a brief introduction of who you can expect to see on a regular basis, our team that we put before you, just a brief overview of our credentials, and then really the work plan that we have over the next, as we hit the ground running over the next 30 to 60 days. But in terms of introductions, my name's Kevin Roddy. I'm here in Richmond. I'm a partner with the firm. I've spent my entire career servicing Virginia local governments, had a lot of experience with multi-jurisdictional entities, so I get the challenges that are involved with that and building consensus. To my immediate left is Christy Choi. Christy's a director with PFM located in Arlington. Christy also serves local governments, but has a good amount of transportation experience. Christy's the point person for our relationship with NVTA, and also worked with VDOT on that 81 project. And then my partner to the far left is Joanne Carter. Joanne and I run the Virginia practice, and besides handling some of PFM's largest municipal clients, Joanne has a lot of transportation expertise as well. Joanne works with MBTA. Joanne was deploying on the I-81 expansion project, and then also works with VRE, which is a credit that's surprisingly similar and going to be doing a transaction this year. Yeah, another PFM resource that we'll utilize is Liang Shan. Liang's a transportation expert, spends 100% of her time on transportation issues. She's the point person on HR TAC. And so in addition to doing other transportation projects throughout the country, we involved 2 sub-consultants on our engagement. Sustainable Capital, Jerome Cox is out of New York, and we'll be utilizing his services. And then Richard Hurlberg is a local attorney. We used him on I-81, and on legal matters, we'll be calling upon Richard's expertise. So that's a brief overview of the team and who you can expect to see on a regular basis. On the next slide, it's just an overview of our credentials. We obviously wouldn't be selected if we didn't have solid credentials. We know the competition for this business was extremely tough, but this is what PFM does on a daily basis. Everybody here at the table, we spend 100% of our time on this. We have a lot of expertise across the country, in Virginia, and most importantly for y'all, in the transportation arena. We've got direct experience with NBTA and HR TAC, as I mentioned, from the get-go, really getting them up and running. So a lot of the issues that you're talking about here are issues that we've helped them navigate. Every engagement's different, so we aren't saying that we have 100% of the answers today, but we can help you certainly get there. And then the 2 other engagements that I mentioned, VDOT did a tax revenue deal last summer, so recent experience in the market on that. And then VRE is going to be coming out with one this summer. So a lot of lessons learned, very fresh information to the extent that we decide to move forward with bonding. And that's certainly going to be discussions that we're going to have along the way. So just a little bit overview of our credentials there, and I'm going to turn it over to Christy, and she's going to talk about the next 60 days for us.
Morning. So since we've been notified of the committee and the board selection, we have been underway in the information gathering process. So we've had a kickoff call with the team, Martha, Chet, and Matt and Eric. So we're in the process of really getting up to speed. We've also had another virtual meeting with Mr. Parsons to talk about the project prioritization process and what you have coming for the next 4-year project and the timing of that selection process. In the next 2 to 3 months, we're going to continue on with the information gathering, and we're hoping to have one-on-one meetings with the CVTA members so that we can get a better understanding of your objectives and vision so that we can help bring that to reality. And then we're also hoping to have ongoing meetings with the finance director's working group to start talking about elements of debt policies, thinking about targeted ranges, incorporating some of the objectives and visions that we've heard with the CVTA member meeting process. And then sort of getting to the point that Mr. Brown was making earlier in the meeting, we're also going to be developing a tool so that we can layer in the revenue streams, the project expenditures, to think about the cash flow needs of the authority and where gaps may be, so that can help us in informing the debt and pay-go question, and ultimately that will also inform the targeted ranges of the debt policy. And then when we are done with all of that process, or as we move along that process, we hope to present our findings to this committee as well as the board as we go along. So we have a lot of work planned to do here, and we're very excited, and we hope to continue on our relationship with you.
I dare say you have a full plate. Any questions for our friends at PFM?
And all this is gonna be done in the next 60 days.
Ms. Heater?
Mr. Chair, I think one of the things that we talked with the PFM team about in that kickoff call was in today's meeting with you, getting direction from the Finance Committee for how a presentation could be structured to be most beneficial for the full authority at the end of the month. So Mr. Thornton, we were thinking that you might like to have this team come to speak to the whole group. And so what would be the most beneficial for them to focus on as they prepare for that?
Could we let, have you finished with your presentation?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Members?
So,
Mr. Brown?
you know, we've had some preliminary presentations, both by staff here in our VA, and we've got the benefit of presentations from NBTAC and HR TAC and NBTA. But I think it'd be helpful to revisit that, because it's been some time, it's been over a year. And just kind of, you know, here again are the models that have been used. And maybe we build the presentation with, okay, here were their goals, right? Their goals were, for example, Hampton Roads, big projects, long list that's been lingering for a long time. Here's how they tackled it. Northern Virginia, long list, but a little bit of a different model, right? And what they were trying to do with multimodal transportation. Here's how they tackled it. And then a couple of what ifs, right? What if you were to live in the Hampton Roads model, live in the Northern Virginia model, or some other hybrid model, right? And I mean, we've talked about a PAYGO model. What's the hypothetical scenario, what that looks like from your perspective? And tying back to my prior question, you know, I'll be honest, the vision for this thing was that there are big things that we want to do that we cannot do individually, and that we were not going to be able to get the state to do for us. So recognizing that we live in in that world of things that are too big for us to do as individual jurisdictions, but that benefit the region, but too expensive to expect the state to carry the bill. What's an optimal way to think about how we get at those in a reasonably practical time period, right? Because no one did, I mean, the Fall Line Trail is a great example. If we had tried to do the Fall Line Trail the way other trails have been done, it would have taken us 20 years. Because of the CVTA, we're going to do it in what? 4, 3, 2, right? I mean, that's our fingers crossed. That's a big thing that the state wasn't going to do for us and that we couldn't do individually. And we figured out how to do it. There are other big things that we should be talking about. And I know this is just my perspective, so the other members of the committee say that I don't want to do any, you know, penny stuff, right? That's not why this is here, right? This is here to do big things. The regional pot, right? Localities have their sites of the pot and do their local stuff. But the regional pot is to do big things. Fall Line Trail is an example. How do we talk about the big things? And what are some models to do those things in an aggressive fashion?
Yeah, I was just going to add to Mr. Brown's point. I think our initial goals for this body is for us to be somewhat ambitious, right? What does that ambitious vision look like? How do we get there? But at the end of the day, we don't want to be reckless as well. I think we are very proud of the financial stability of our localities in this region compared to other regions as well, not just here in the Commonwealth, but in other states. When you look at the Richmond region, we are very stable and very proud of our financial standing. So how do we achieve these ambitious goals, but not be reckless about it? I think we all represent different localities, different bodies. We have all different philosophies, but at least we can agree that there's some ambitious things that we want to do as a region. How do we get there? That's why we're asking for your expertise. That's why I think you're here. If that's the gist, or at least that's covered in the presentation, I think we'll go a long way for a lot of the members who are not around this table. Mr. Doe.
Mr. Chairman, I want to kind of follow up what you said, and Mr. Brown said, to you, Mr. Roddy, that as you have worked with other auspicious groups, that, each group is different. So therefore, we talk about really customization. And then I also heard some of my colleagues talk about, not necessarily small thinking. But it's very important, though, for us to understand that there will be competition among groups like ours. So one of the things I think that would be very efficacious for us as a group would be, what are some thoughts as we are making those great designs so that this group could be an outstanding and competitive group for the 21st century. So that's also would be important to a group like this. You see various things with other groups, and that group is not like us. But I think, as Mr. Brown said, there will be a time where there has to be collegiality among some of these other groups. And that kind of information, it really can be very helpful to CVTA. And so we're relying on you to do your very best and gathering information and data for us. So that would be helpful.
Mr. Carroll.
Chair. All great comments, everything that we said. Thing that concerns me is the environment which we found ourselves in now in the world. What's happening with the cost of fuel sales in the Commonwealth, they continue to go up, which I believe is going to have a negative impact on travel and on our economy. And we need to make sure, as we're looking forward, that we get the best financial advice on what our capabilities will be. I think we're going to probably see forecast change on what our numbers look like. They had already been predicted to be lower, and I think what's going on in the country, unless things turn around, I'd see those forecasts going even lower, which is going to affect our ability on how much money we get coming in and how much money we can actually spend on the future. And so I think it's important for us to have strong market analysis on those issues as well as part of what we're considering, so we can make sure that we don't overextend ourselves in the future and put ourselves in a position where we can't meet our financial obligations. Mr. Chair.
Ms. Peterson.
Just to follow up on everything that's been said here to some degree, and I know we started off talking about what you're going to present to the full body. And I think it'll be very helpful to know, as we mentioned before you made your presentation, we put a placeholder in with a 10% on debt situation until we got your services and started working on it a little bit closer. We've all been very conscious of that. As we do go for using debt, we want to make sure that our bond ratings are at the upper echelon so that we get the best rates. And obviously, we've talked about reserves and that might be necessary to make that happen. And it's still back and forth on how much we go pay go versus how much do we go with that debt to get these projects done. And in that process, we've had several of these meetings. I believe all of them are on YouTube, recorded on YouTube, are they not? So I would encourage you to go back and to look at our previous meetings and our previous discussions in these areas that we have done, and I think that would be very helpful to you in bringing it to the full body.
Great. Any other comments, questions? All right, thank you, Mr. Roddy, and your team for coming today, and we look forward to working with you to achieve some of these ambitious goals that we have for our region. So, Thank you so much. All right, moving to item 9 now, the preliminary FY 2023 budget review. I believe, Ms. Skeeter, you're gonna handle that.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. If you would just first turn to page 11 in your packet. This is not new information, but I wanted to be able to sort of ground us in this. These are the projections that you've seen in different format before for the revenues, based on, I think it was the January updates. So we've had 2 updates this fiscal year, and this is the most recent revenue forecast for sales tax and fuel tax. On the expense side, these are just broken out by the formula. We've for purposes of today's discussion, held the off the top, if you will, distribution to the operating account at $500,000. That's consistent with the last 2 fiscal years for the authority, and then done the mathematical calculation of the 35, 15%, and 50% set aside. So that's how, that's the basis for how I've structured the operating budget. So if you'll flip then to page 12, I'll say kind of taking the agenda points a little bit out of order. We want to accomplish several things today with the discussion about this agenda. This item culminates in a request to be able to move forward with a recommendation for public hearing and advertising so that we can stay on schedule with setting the next fiscal year operating budget. But it also is important because, as you all know from the last authority meeting, the Personnel Committee with Mr. Spoonhour and Mrs. Page are anxious to know what the budget is for the executive director search. So there's a couple of sort of decision points embedded in this item. So I'll tackle that one first for you. You'll see there, and just as a point of comparison, I've included figures for comparison to this fiscal year. For purposes of budgeting, we've put as a placeholder here the $458,000 figure for administration and staffing. That number is comprised of 2 key things. The first is just a set aside based on the current MOU with Plan RBA. That's at $210,000. We haven't negotiated that yet for Plan RBA and CVTA, and so that number will come down. But at this point, I just held it steady so that we could kind of go through the budget process. The other component of that is a set aside of $248,220, and that represents the high end of the salary that has been provided through the study that was conducted by the HR Roundtable, loaded with benefits to include health and dental, taxes, insurance, retirement and life insurance. So that's about a 26% factor there on average, depending on the different pay scales. Pardon?
All that is include the
Yes,
benefits
sir.
in the number you have here.
Yes, sir. So that's a fully loaded number, if you will. And so I ran scenarios based on the summary of salary findings and recommendations that the HR Roundtable put together and just provided to you all previously. They had indicated that a range could be $126,000 to $200,000 a year, and then they itemized depending on the skill set and the scope of the position. It could be, kind of anywhere in there. So I ran 4 points in that range: 126,000, 150, 170, and 200. For purposes of budget, I put it at the $200,000 salary level and fully loaded, so that brings it to 248. But just so that you know, kind of how that methodology came through. So what we were hoping to do today is, just for purposes of that line item, get some direction from the Finance Committee as to what salary range can be used as part of the negotiation process for the executive director search, because as you know, that is underway. The close date for those applications is March 31st. I wanted to put this in the context of the budget so that you could see that we can still achieve that high end of the salary increase, as has been discussed in previous meetings, with still that $500,000 contribution from next year's revenues. So I'll bring you down to the bottom line. You can see that the total operating budget for fiscal 2023 is $773,000. The difference between the $500,000 contribution from next year's revenues and that budget amount is the carryover. And so I think you all are familiar with those numbers. We've looked at them actually several times over the last few months, but that's how the numbers kind of fall through. So Mr. Chair, I can walk you through the rest of the budget, or if you want to take a pause and talk through specifics around that personnel executive director search, and I'll point out Mr. Spoonhour is here today, I think, probably to listen, but also to provide additional context to what that committee would be looking for from today's
I
discussion.
think, yeah, talking about the executive director, salary range and some of the work that Mr. Spoonhour is working on, I think that'd be appropriate. You come on, join the big table, you like.
It's so much nicer back
I
ain't gonna lie. Yeah, my jacket. So happy to answer any questions that I'll probably be lying out in front, but really do appreciate, we did launch the executive director search without a salary. So having something, and we appreciate the roundtable's work in getting us there. But obviously, to make sure we're getting the right candidates, make sure when we're talking to, it's a lot more powerful when we know if we're in the ballpark with somebody's thinking, hey, I'm coming in at 250 to 300 versus, hey, we're just not in that ballpark. So making it a better use of everybody's time, because as I like to tell everybody, HR Roundtable is leaning in, but I'm sure their county administrators haven't taken anything off their plate, and they are working very hard and expeditiously for us. So I appreciate your time today.
And it's fair to say that this is a competitive, fully loaded package right here.
Yeah, I mean, we think so. I mean, we've done benchmarking with our health insurance coverage previously through Gallagher, and I think we have a pretty competitive, there's certainly improvements that we can do. We have a pretty competitive coverage, certainly aren't, at the Cadillac level, but we do well comparatively to our partners.
Just ask because, the market has changed out there recently.
Yeah. Just so you know, the HR Roundtable, when we did benchmarks with other organizations like this of different sizes and other PDCs, and this is where we felt we'd be able to get a good, strong candidate for what we need.
Mr. Chair, I ask a question. Is there anyone on the committee that would want to constrain the, obviously that's the upper limit. Obviously the team that's doing the hiring, I'm not sure who is going to actually do that interview. I know we talked about that a couple meetings ago. They know the ceiling, right? I think you guys are all savvy negotiators. Is there anyone that would suggest that you constrain that group more than what we have already?
When you say constraint, Mr. Brown.
Meaning, I guess my thinking would be, we have a range, but you guys go find the person.
Right, we just want to agree on that range.
Yeah,
That's pretty much.
So I guess my question is, does anyone want to change the range, lower the range?
Exactly.
Okay.
No.
So do we have a motion to approve the range?
So moved.
Let's make sure that we clarify what the range is in that motion, please.
The range is right here, correct?
Yeah, so, well, the budget includes the upper limit, so the range would be 126 to 200,000. That would be obviously the classification
For
range.
those watching at home.
For those watching it.
And then the budget incorporates the calculated benefits cost for the upcoming fiscal year.
So the 126 to 200 is the base salary.
That's correct.
Plus benefits.
That's correct.
So there's a motion to approve base salary range for the executive director of CVTA from 126,000 to 200,000. That's the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion's been seconded. Ms. Fires.
Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Vice Chair Peterson.
Aye.
Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
Chair Stoney.
Aye.
Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Thank you. That concludes your vote.
Mr. Spoonhour, your hard work has finally come to fruition. Not yet.
HR Roundtable, hard work.
HR Roundtable.
Which is representing. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Thornton, for setting up that personnel committee to get us where we are today in conjunction with the HR Roundtable. Number of HR's subject matter experts working from our localities, our core localities. So thank you everyone for the participation. And we'll move on to, I'm sorry, Ms. Hugh, do you have anything further?
Not on that item, no. I'm ready for you.
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple more questions
Sure.
as we get down to the administrative side.
Yep, go ahead.
I'm looking at meeting expenses, it's cut by 50%. But then right below that, I see where office space and leasing, the 10,000, is that basically a trade-off, is what you're looking at there?
Yeah, again, because we haven't been through the process with Plan RVA, that board meets tomorrow, and the executive committee will have the first opportunity to really receive the update from the discussion at the last authority meeting about the Plan RVA hosting the CVTA and the continuing basis. I have that set as a placeholder there.
Okay,
The
so, but
assumption.
that's a balancing act.
That's right. The assumption is that the CVTA, previously we had held that $20,000 budget for hosting meetings off-site at different locations. My assumption is that the CVTA meetings will continue to be held at the Plan RVA offices, and we would take responsibility for providing that space. And so that's where that trade-off is, as you have pointed out.
And one last question that I have is down at reserves for contingencies. We've, that's a pretty significant drop in the reserve. Can you tell us why we're reducing our contingency that much?
Yeah, so I think the best way to look at that is really when you look at the difference in the administration and staffing line, as the placeholders are there now, that delta between fiscal 2022 and 23 compared to the reserve for contingency, that's really where you see the change. I don't think that the negotiated agreement with Plan RDA is going to be at the $210,000 level, because obviously we're trading out some of our staff support for the new executive director. But until we work through that process, I've held that assumption there. We've talked about this a little bit before. I mean, we're benefiting in this coming fiscal year if you want to retain that $500,000 contribution. We're benefiting from that accumulated carryover from fiscal 21, 22 into 23. But it's not a sustainable path from some of that modeling that I had shown to you all earlier.
We've got about 130-some thousand, about 130,000 change in contingency. Are we holding enough contingency at 83,000? I mean, I don't know how magic 500,000 is on this. I mean, I know that's what we're started out at, but I want to make sure I want to make sure we don't shortchange ourselves either.
Yeah, I think that's a question, I mean, really kind of a question for the finance committee and what you want the approach to be. We knew that $500,000 felt like a good figure for the first 2 years, and I think your question is a good one. What do you want your contingency reserve for operating to be? As a percent of total, it's not a terrible figure for year 3 of operation, but I think setting some targets from the finance committee would be helpful.
Well, I think that's something we can do together with.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it did jump out at me as quite a significant change.
Absolutely.
Good questions, Mr. Peters.
Mr. Chair, can I make one more comment?
Sure, Mr. Parsons.
I think that's a great point, Mr. Peterson. And one of the things that we know now is that we've been operating as an authority for over a year, and we have a better understanding of the realistic numbers that we need to deal with on an annual basis. So I think Ms. Heater is rightfully trying to operate on a lean basis and with an understanding of what our expenses are. But if Finance Committee wants to establish a base contingency, I think that's a great idea. One of the things I did want to raise is we had the contingency there previously because there were expenses, for example, the third-party cost estimates. We didn't know what those were actually going to be, but now that we're a year in, we have an understanding, so we can budget for that in the line item more realistically. So I appreciate you.
Okay, that's that. I'm only asking questions. I don't know the answer.
That's why. You shouldn't give it away like that.
Not to belabor that, but I will say, because of how we calculate the distributions, it is more complicated to change that off the top contribution mid-fiscal year. So I would recommend that when we get to item C, if you all think that you want to think about a higher level of contribution from the revenues next fiscal year, more than that 500,000, from a staff perspective, I would encourage you to think about that in advance of the fiscal year starting, because it's harder to be able to walk that back if you change it mid-fiscal year. At the same time, I recognize you're in an executive director search, and you may well want to have the PFM team and that executive director weigh in. So we tried to, as Chet said, kind of create a conservative budget based on what we know, to give you what we think are adequate resources to run the organization next fiscal year. But it may not be, that base contribution may not be what's appropriate in future fiscal years.
Mr. Thornton has told us many times, it's a work in progress.
Work in progress.
Ready for B?
Ready for B.
Okay, so B is really specific to the line item on insurance. Just to give you a refresher, we did insurance coverage. It's the policy for the CVTA is pretty limited. You know, it's the base coverage for officers and directors insurance. You know, the liabilities insurance appropriate for the organization. That certainly evolves over time. We've just been working through the renewal process. Virginia Risk Sharing Alliance Versa has a new process, a system this year for renewal. So they will get back to us after March 15th. That's the deadline that they've set for all renewal clients to input their data. So we've put these assumptions in there to be able to start that process, but we actually won't get the quote for next fiscal year until sometime after that March 15th date. The question I have for you all specific to this is if that sort of around $10,000, if it looks reasonable, would you recommend authorization for staff to go ahead and initiate that renewal, or do you want to see it come back to you at the April meeting when we have the information? Just wanted to know how you wanted us to treat that renewal process.
We're looking at renewing with the same company. Mr. Chair, I would think, renew with the same company and just come back to us and let us know what the bottom line is. Imagine it's not $10,000 on the budget.
Yeah, I think it was 9 and some change last year. So I can tell you, we were expecting, because of some discounting and some things like that, I mean, we got a rebate on the Plan RVA side. So, I mean, you know, I just don't know what the numbers are going to come back out, but I think they're going to be right around there.
With everyone else?
I'm happy to go through.
Mr. Chair, they're going to require a motion.
Oh, pardon. Yeah, thank you. It would be nice to have
I'll make that motion.
There's a motion, this has been seconded. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded. Ms. Firestone.
Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Vice Chair Peterson.
Aye.
Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
Chair Stoney.
Aye.
Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Thank you. Ms. Heaton?
Okay, item C is the request to forward a recommendation to the full authority for authorization to publish the administrative and operating expense budget for public hearing. As you could already hear, I mean, there are some assumptions in here based on some unknowns. So we've tried to build a budget that hopefully would give you some comfort to move forward, but recognizing that things like the insurance renewal, there may be some changes there. I will alert you that on the audit, the $15,000 that's listed there, the 3-year agreement that we have with PD Bears is actually for 19. So I do need to make that adjustment. But otherwise, I think all of the figures are relatively solid. Discussion with PFM on the financial advisory services. It's an annual retainer amount, so we just need to work with legal counsel to figure out whether we forward fund that in this fiscal year, if you will, or, you know, sort of what the structure looks like as it. So I held out the whole of an annual retainer amount estimate there. So that's more of a timing of expenditure issue. So some of that may be actually paid this fiscal year. We don't have recruitment dollars set aside in this fiscal year budget simply because we're going through recruitment this fiscal year. And then I put the contracted services as a placeholder for $50,000. We'll talk about that more when we get to the fiscal 2022 budget amendment, but that's based on just the assumption again that we would do third-party cost estimates for projects for prioritization next year. So we wanted to have that in the budget. Most of the other line items are either standard to what was approved already for this current fiscal year. We did increase technology services and support just to be able to onboard that new executive director, get them
computer peripherals and technology things that they would need as a new employee. And then Mr. Peterson already called out the sort of the transition on that meetings expense to office leasing, and that swap of dollars there, but relatively everything else is pretty much in line with what's been approved in the prior year budgets.
The office furniture for it, Mr. Chair, that's a one-time expense probably.
That's right, yeah, and I mean, I don't have those numbers yet because we frankly haven't bid the dollar, we don't know the amount of what we're gonna be spending on furniture from the Plan RBA side. So those will be coming over the next couple of months, but we felt like this was adequate. Yeah, thanks. Mr. Parsons just reminded me, we did slightly increase the public engagement website. As you all know, the CVTA content has been sitting inside the Plan RBA website framework right now. We would recommend that we create an actual web presence that's unique to CVTA. And so we put dollars carried over and added a little bit based on some other bidding that we've seen recently for website content development. We still obviously want to create that, I'll say, seamless narrative about how Plan RBA, the TPO, and the CVTA work together. But we do think that it would be good to be able to give the CVTA a bit more of its own identity and be able to have that web presence. You already have your own URL and those kinds of things. So really it's just kind of being able to separate from the Plan RBA architecture a bit more and just make that process. So that's what that line item is.
And Ms. Heater, do you have a request action for item C?
Yeah, so if these numbers look comfortable to you, I would say with the caveat that if we get new information before the March full authority meeting and they're within reason of this overall budget, then I would request a motion from this committee to recommend CVTA authorize a public hearing at their March 25th meeting.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
All right, this is there's been a motion to adopt a resolution recommending a CVTA authorization of a public hearing on the FY 2023 CVTA administrative and operating expense budget. It's been motioned. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and second. Ms. Firestone. And any discussion? Ms. Firestone.
Okay, Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Mr. Peterson,
Aye.
Mr. Thornton,
Aye.
Chair Stoney,
Aye.
Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Next item.
Yes, next item.
Okay, this one should be just as easy. We are requesting 3 transfers from line items totaling $125,000 from the reserved for contingency line. Requesting a transfer of $50,000 for administration and staffing, $25,000 for financial advisory services, and $50,000 for contracted services. The $50,000 for administration and staffing is really just to be able to create an adequate buffer for that recruitment and onboarding should that occur. I'm estimating that new executive director could onboard as soon as the beginning of June, depending on how the process goes. So I wanted to be able to give some maximum flexibility. Certainly $50,000 is more than ample for the last month of the fiscal year for salary and benefits and any sort of enticement or signing bonus or anything like that. But wanted to just be able to create that wiggle room there. As far as the financial advisory services, again, as I mentioned, the contract that we have with CVTA will have with PFM is under legal review right now and subject to kind of a final negotiation and execution, but this number provides, I think, adequate funding to be able to cover that initial retainer if the decision is recommended to pay that out of this fiscal year's budget. And then finally, the $50,000 for contracted services is to address the third-party contracting that was bid out and utilized through Chesterfield County's on-call engineering services program, and that was used to inform the project prioritization process. I think the actual engagement is about $42,000, but we just put a round number for that transfer to cover that. So the 3 requested transfers, again, from reserve for contingency, totaling $125,000.
Any discussion?
I'll move for approval of that one too, Mr. Chairman.
All right, there's a motion to recommend, approve and recommend the transfers as presented by Ms. Heater. That's up to $125,000, I believe. Is there a second?
Second, Mr. Brown's got it. Your turn, Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown seconded. Bush, Ms. Firestone. Everybody wants to get in on the game, I guess. Ms. Firestone.
Thank you. Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Vice Chair Peterson.
Aye.
Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
Chair Stoney.
Aye.
And Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Thank you.
Ms. Eater, anything further?
No, sir, I'm finished, thank you.
That concludes new business, other business. We have a range of topics that we plan to take up in future meetings. Our future meeting, next meeting is on April 13th, 2022. Are there any comments from the committee members?
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. A couple weeks in now. I appreciate all the well wishes I received on my engagement. I really appreciate everyone, and I appreciate the advice as well that I was given. Strong communication goes a long way. I get it. I
Someone
get it.
said run, Forrest, run.
There's no warranty with this one. All right, this meeting is adjourned.
Always found that yes, dear works pretty well.
Just saying yes.
Yes, dear.
Yes, yes.
Yes, no, yes, dear.
Yes.
Just say yes.